Well, good afternoon from Canberra, everybody. Welcome to this special ASPI event. I'm Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of ASPI, and it's a great pleasure today to be able to present to you a speech from President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan, and then to follow that up with a discussion presentation from some knowledgeable colleagues around Taiwanese politics and affairs. Great to have everyone here. I'm now going to briefly throw to a 13-minute presentation from President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan, President of the Republic. Born in 1956 in Taipei City, Tsai Ing-wen grew up as an auto repair shop run by her parents, learning the values of thrift and dedication. Dr. Tsai graduated from the National Taiwan University with a Bachelor of Laws degree in 1978, and she then studied in the US and the UK, obtaining a Master of Laws degree from Cornell University in 1980 and a PhD in law from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 1984. After Dr. Tsai finished her studies, she returned to Taiwan, pursuing an academic career, and then in the late 1980s began her tenure as part of the Taiwan Trade Negotiation Delegation. In the late 1990s, Dr. Tsai served successively as Senior Advisor to the Mainland Affairs Council, Senior Advisor to the National Security Council, and Chairperson of the Mainland Affairs Council, devoting her efforts to the development of cross-straits relations. Dr. Tsai then joined the Democratic Progressive Party in 2004 and became a DPP legislator at large 2005 to 2006. She was appointed to serve as Vice Premier 2006 to 2007. After the DPP then became the opposition party, Dr. Tsai was elected DPP chairperson for 2 successive terms, the first woman to chair a major political party in Taiwan. In the presidential election in 2012, Dr. Tsai became Taiwan's first female presidential candidate. She ran again as DPP candidate in 2016 and was elected as the nation's 14th term president. That made Dr. Tsai the first female head of state in Taiwan's history, and Tsai Ing-wen is also the first female head of state in Asia who was not born into a political family. Dr. Tsai represented the DPP in the nation's 15th term presidential election in 2020 and was successfully re-elected with over 8.17 million votes, the highest total in Taiwan's history. Dr. Tsai was officially sworn in as the 15th term president in May and currently serves as the DPP chairperson. It was a great pleasure to have Dr. Tsai agree to speak to ASPI. I believe this is the first time that a president of Taiwan has actually made an address specifically to the Australian people through the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. So let's now listen to Dr. Tsai Ing-wen's address.
Participants of the Indo-Pacific Leaders Dialogue and all those watching this live stream, good morning. It is wonderful to be with you all through this internet. I would like to begin my talk with a special thanks to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute for hosting this important event. It is my honor and pleasure to take part in the Pacific Leaders Dialogue at a time when the Indo-Pacific region is facing many significant challenges. I will use today's opportunity to share with you Taiwan's perspectives in navigating through this critical time. In recent years, the multifaceted relationship Taiwan and Australia share has grown even closer, propelled by our shared values of democracy and freedom. Taiwan and Australia have found an increased number of issues and opportunities in education, tourism, trade, culture, science, and security to collaborating, resulting in mutually beneficial outcomes. This year, Taiwan and Australia, like the rest of the world, are facing the challenges brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. Once again, as democratic allies, we have found ways to assist each other under these most unfortunate circumstances. For example, in March, as we dealt with a shortage of materials for epidemic prevention, Australia graciously offered Taiwan 1 million liters of alcohol to make more than 4 million bottles of 75% alcohol sanitizer. While in exchange, Taiwan provided 3 metric tons of non-woven fabrics, the key raw material for surgical mask production. It is because of this kind of mutual assistance, both Taiwan and Australia were able to weather the first wave of the COVID-19 outbreak. At the same time, medical research team from Taiwan's Chang'an University and Australia's Monash University have been working together to develop a treatment for COVID-19 and have achieved positive results. I firmly believe it is through this kind of cooperation, transparency in communication, and information sharing that we can finally get past this dangerous pandemic. On the economic front, the pandemic has caused an accelerated restructuring of supply chains. One positive aspect of this effect is it allows us to re-examine and reassess economic and trade cooperation. I have always said that the economic relationship between Taiwan and Australia is mutually beneficial. Australia is a major exporter of agricultural products to Taiwan, with meat, wheat, and dairy being the most important exports. In addition, health-conscious consumers in Taiwan are big fans of Australia's health supplements, food, and beverages. On the other hand, Australia imports telecommunication equipment and parts, refined petroleum, computers, motorcycles, and bicycles from Taiwan. Australia's prominence in the supply of agricultural products and the significant values of Taiwan's high-tech exports epitomize the complementary nature of trade relationship between our two countries. Moreover, Australia is now Taiwan's second largest provider of natural gas. Australian firms are also playing a crucial role in Taiwan's endeavor to utilize more green energy by establishing offshore wind farms. With all these existing economic and trade relations between our countries, my hope is to begin negotiations for a Taiwan-Australia Economic Cooperation Agreement in the very near future, so we can uncover more opportunities that benefit both our countries. One of these opportunities is Taiwan's inclusion in the CPTPP. Taiwan's participation in this Trans-Pacific partnership will naturally also benefit Australia as a member country. Now that we have talked about the regional economic partnership, let me also speak a bit about the region our countries share, the Indo-Pacific region. Taiwan and Australia are key members of the Indo-Pacific region. The preservation of peace and prosperity in the region is both our responsibility and in our best interest. The joint declaration from the Australia-US Ministerial Consultation reiterated the importance of Taiwan for the region. The declaration asserted strong support for Taiwan and pledged cooperation with Taiwan to provide aid and assistance through the development of the Pacific Island countries. For this, I want to express our gratitude. The state of our region is changing rapidly, and thus requires the most comprehensive strategic adjustment since World War II. Gray zone activities exemplifies and constitute the challenges we must face together. In recent years, the government of Australia adjusted its own regional strategy to reflect the pace of change in the region. it became more proactive in its national defense. We are deeply impressed by Australia's rapid actions taken to protect not only itself but the region. Additionally, Australia's Pacific Startup Policy and the Indo-Pacific endeavors have since 2017 elucidated your government's steadfast commitment to the region. The activities included in the Indo-Pacific endeavor, such as humanitarian aid, disaster relief, and improvement of maritime capabilities, are also where Taiwan's strengths lie. It is my hope that Taiwan can also collaborate with Australia in these efforts to maintain stability and peace in the region. Taiwan has also been making and maintaining partnerships in the Pacific for many decades. We have worked with our diplomatic allies to improve infrastructure, agriculture technology, sanitation, medical services, and clean energy. We have also assisted them in human resources training and encouraged cultural exchanges. When it comes to the maintenance of regional stability, peace, and development, Australia and Taiwan have been standing together at the forefront. Both Taiwan and Australia are committed to upholding the rules-based international order and employing transparency and accountability as the basis for cooperation. On the other hand, what we do not want to see is countries violating the existing rules-based order for the purpose of flexing their military might, threatening and eroding the free and open Indo-Pacific region. Now, I have spoken about freedom and democracy throughout this talk. I want to mention one of the biggest challenges we have to tackle. That is the Hong Kong version of the National Security Law. The passage of this law garnered tremendous attention from the international community. In Taiwan, we strongly support the people of Hong Kong's quest for democracy, freedom, and human rights, and we commend our democratic allies such as Australia, the US, UK, and Canada for taking actions to support Hong Kong and safeguard democracy. We're also paying close attention to the potential hotspots of conflict in the East and South China Sea. We call on the international community to be vigilant and work together in accordance with international law to resolve any issue or conflict peacefully. Not only is the situation in East and South China Seas disconcerting to all in the region, another challenge we have to confront is the threat of our information and communication security. Both public and private institutions in Taiwan and Australia have been experiencing large-scale systemic hacking and cyber attacks in recent years. Over the past few years, the Taiwanese government has been dedicated to the development of our information and communication security industry and safety net. We hope to invoke Taiwan's experience, our expertise and technology to assist countries in the Indo-Pacific region, especially Pacific Island nations, to advance their cybersecurity. In this regard, I must again commend the Australian government for its leading efforts in this area. Australia's Cyber Bootcamp Project and Pacific Cybersecurity Operational Network are all impressive examples of Australia's leadership that would ultimately improve information and communication security in the Pacific. Taiwan is also dedicated to information and communication security. We're now setting up Taiwan Digital Opportunity Centers for our diplomatic allies in the Pacific. We are helping our diplomatic allies train technological experts and improve their cyber environment. Taiwan and Australia have common goals. We want to not only improve the information and communication environment, we are also working towards equipping Pacific Island countries with the necessary ammunition to combat disinformation. I firmly believe this is another area that needs cooperation between Taiwan and Australia. Taiwan is capable of and dedicated to making contributions to the world. One of Taiwan's strong suits is our ability to cultivate and nurture talents. The youth are our future. We have always been very encouraging to young people to travel abroad and broaden their horizons. Every year, more than 10,000 young Taiwanese people go to Australia for the Working Holiday Program. Last year, more than 18,000 Taiwanese students studied abroad in Australia. Other than education and cultural exchanges, products from Australia are very popular in Taiwan. For example, Taiwan's specialty, beef noodle soup, is often made with Australian beef. Taiwan's supermarkets are stocked with top quality Australian potatoes and wine. I want to encourage Australian friends to come to Taiwan to see our wonderful scenery with your own eyes and taste our exciting cuisines. To conclude, I want to say this. The relationship between Taiwan and Australia has grown quite close in recent years through exchanges in many areas, despite the distance between our two countries. We have noticed Australia's effort to build greater support for democracy and freedom and to raise awareness of the challenges posed by the authoritarian actors and states. The people of Taiwan are proud of their democracy and are encouraged by Australia's dedication to stand with, safeguard, and promote democracy. I am very confident that Taiwan and Australia will rise successfully together to meet future challenges and maintain peace and prosperity for our region.
We have a lot to talk about. President Tsai covered many issues in 13 minutes, very succinctly, everything from COVID to military muscle flexing and the rule of law, the impact of the Hong Kong national security law, potential hot points, cybersecurity, Pacific Island partnerships, the youth of our two countries, the opportunities for Australia-Taiwan bilateral relations, lots of things to discuss. And I'm joined with a fantastic panel that will be able to spend the next 45 minutes with exploring some of Dr. Tsai's comments. I should also add that President Tsai was able to provide some follow-up information for us to follow up questions that we asked after her speech, and I'll be able to play those for you sequentially as we go through our discussions today. But let me introduce our discussants for the next 45 minutes or so. Dr. Chen-wei Lin, Chief Executive Officer, Institute National Defence and Security Research. Chen-wei, great to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
From another important island to Australia, Dr. Mark Harrison, Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at the University of Tasmania, my old alma mater. Mark, great to have you here. And Sam Hoffman from ASPI. Samantha, great to see you as well. Thanks very much for joining us all. Before I get to the follow-up questions that we put to President Tsai, let me begin by asking you all about your own reactions to the key messages from the President's speech. What does this tell you, do you think, about the President's agenda for her second term? And what do you think it is that is most important from her perspective to be getting across to an Australian audience? Mark, can I start with you?
Yeah, I think continuity and stability is really has been a key message through her election campaign and what she's been trying to emphasize. Very strong affirmation of Taiwan's democratic sovereignty, so she's a strong leader. I think a strong position on Beijing in terms of how we might think about her first term and her second term. First term had a lot of domestic political issues, truth and reconciliation and apology to Taiwan's indigenous people and the same-sex marriage issue. Second term, she's placed a greater emphasis, much greater emphasis on defense preparedness and strengthening Taiwan's defense forces, and broadly speaking, strengthening Taiwan's international position through outreach to many governments around the world.
Chen-wei, what stood out for you in the President's comments?
Well, I think Mark captured it very well, actually. The commitment to peace and stability, that is the top priority for her second term. And in addition to that, I think the most important message for the Australian audience is that we share many common values where both democracy, uphold the rule of law, human rights, respect human rights. And these are things that provide a very sound foundation for our bilateral relationship, and certainly something we can work with to deepen our cooperations, not just bilaterally, but also with the Pacific Island nations, where we have many diplomatic allies.
And Sam, standout thoughts from you?
For me, one thing that really stood out was President Tsai's spoke of information and communication security. And one thing I think we can watch for in her second term is whether she can successfully build on the success of legislating the Anti-Infiltration Act and more strict definitions of Chinese-owned enterprises to improve strategic communications and cement public confidence in Taiwan's security. I think that'll be of crucial importance. Another thing that really stood out to me was that President Tsai spoke of the Hong Kong national security law. I think one thing that's been quite worrying for me is in recent years is that PRC escalations in the South China Sea, the situation in Xinjiang, and the situation in Hong Kong, liberal democracies have been incredibly slow to act. And I'm not sure there are signs that it would also meaningfully step up to similar escalations towards Taiwan. And so those are things to think about moving forward.
I want to get onto the bigger strategic pictures, but just before we do, maybe something quickly about the bilateral relationship. Chen-wei, you certainly make the point that the President stresses quite strongly, we're both democracies, we have shared values. Given the constraints of pressure from the PRC, are we actually getting closer, do you think, or is this something that we still need to work on to achieve more outcomes?
Well, I think it's both. We are getting closer, and she used a very, I think, telling example of exchanging alcohol with unwoven cloth. And this sort of cooperation is probably unimaginable a few years ago. But there are also many work ahead and many challenges for both countries to deepen our relationship. And I think eventually we'll probably talk about it later. One of the most important areas is further cooperation on the security policy areas.
And Mark, I notice a question that's come through from our audience is about the possibility of an Australia-Taiwan travel bubble. That's a phrase that might not be so familiar in Taiwan, but we often talk about a travel bubble between ourselves and New Zealand, seeing as we are two countries that have managed to reduce the risk of COVID to a significant extent. Taiwan's done the same thing. Is that a prospect, do you think, for Australia and Taiwan?
We do seem to be a fair way from achieving those kinds of bubbles. I think New Zealand would probably be first on the list. I think it's a great idea. And there's an obvious, there are plenty of direct flights that have been running historically. So it's positive. I think it would send a strong signal in terms of Australia-Taiwan relations. And I think there's a case to be made for it because Taiwan's handling of the pandemic has been so exemplary. So there is perhaps an opportunity there that could be leveraged.
And Sam, looking to your own areas of strength around cyber and emerging technologies, it seemed to me the President made quite a pitch for both for Australian cooperation, perhaps even in the Pacific Islands around cyber security. Your thoughts there?
Sure. Actually, one thing that really stood out to me was I think an area where Australia and Taiwan can improve cooperation is in the Indo-Pacific region, and specifically in advancing cybersecurity. I see this as a key place for improving Australia and Taiwan relations vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific region.
Well, let's go to some of the bigger strategic questions. I thought it, in a very carefully crafted speech, Chen-wei, the President doesn't actually mention China by name. But there is no doubt that when she talks about muscle flexing, when she talks about the application of the rule of law in the Indo-Pacific region, we all know what country she's really talking about there. What's your view of the nature of the challenges that the PRC presents to Taiwan right now? And how's that evolving?
Well, I think there are two aspects we really need to look at when you talk about the nature of challenge PRC is putting Taiwan into. One is the actual military contingency. We understand that PRC has escalated its military activity in the region. Yesterday, I think everybody had read the news. 2 ballistic missiles, the DF-21B and DF-21D, were actually launched into an area near South China Sea. And this is one aspect we need to really look at. And I think there are many possibilities for bilateral as well as multilateral cooperation. The other one I think is also receiving quite a bit of attention in Australia is the malign gray zone tactics. And this involves a wide range of activities from fake news to cyber attacks to biased information, disinformation, paramilitary as well as military activities on the sea. And these gray zone activities do not generate the tremendous amount of intensity, but it does alter the narratives of who is causing the tension, who is causing the trouble, and it does create this sense of uncertainties within our societies. And in every democracy, I think the leaders and the government needs to be held accountable to its people. And when people begin to feel uncertain, that definitely has a huge impact in our domestic politics. And this is this sort of intervention through gray zone tactics, I think, is a real challenge that all of us face.
Chen-wei, I'm interested just to follow that up with you. I mean, I have been observing for some weeks now the ramping up of PRC military pressure against Taiwan. It's very obvious and being very publicly reported. How does this play in terms of reactions amongst the Taiwanese population? You know, when missile launches of the type you describe are reported, does it have a popular impact? Do people just go about their business as though this is nothing particularly unusual? What's the sort of general reaction?
Well, literally, I think we've been at odds with PRC since 1949. So there is an element of familiarity with this sort of hostile actions. But regardless of what TLA does, or what sort of tactics they employ, I believe Taiwanese people are resolute in protecting our own countries. But protecting our own countries certainly does not mean feeling threatened and alter your everyday activities. The most important thing is the economic activities need to maintain its pace. And we've done that tremendously well during this pandemic, and we'll continue to do that.
Sam, what's your sense of this? You've been a resident in Taiwan and you've been watching, as I have, the ramping up of military pressure recently. What's your read about this current strategic situation between Taiwan and the PRC?
I think really Taiwan is facing a bit of an existential crisis. And one thing I think that will be quite important in President Tsai's second term will be defense reform. I think there's both a readiness and morale problem for both the regular and reserve forces. And that's something that we should be paying attention to.
And Mark, your perspective on that before we go to the first grab from President Tsai?
Yeah, look, I just I endorse everything my co-panelists have said. I think PRC policy towards Taiwan is very shaped by very particular ideological fixations. Taiwan in some ways is a metaphor, a political metaphor for the PRC, for thinking about China's rise, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and so on. What that tends to drive are kind of tactical actions by the PRC, and I think Chen-wei has alluded to that. And those can create there's a reason for tactical actions to sort of create incremental advances of its interests, but it generates a significant amount of risk and and a general sort of a baseline of tension that is very difficult for Taiwan to manage and for the international community to manage.
Mark, does the idea of a successful Taiwan democracy threaten the Communist Party in any way? Does that inform their thinking, or is that not even a consideration?
I don't think it does. I think the PRC or Beijing believes that it has the better system, what they see as the fundamentally better system, that has better answers to the problems that that countries face. Much is made of raucousness in the parliament and so on to demonstrate the division and so on, and noise of democratic politics. So no, I don't think that has as much impact as one might think, unfortunately.
That's interesting. Well, let's go to the first question that we put to President Tsai. We asked her to explain her thinking a little bit around the idea of how she interprets one China policy.
As shown in Mr. Xi's statement early last year, Beijing's formulation of one China is in essence one country, two systems. This is not acceptable to the people of Taiwan, especially in light of the developments we have witnessed in Hong Kong. We are a country with a very vibrant democracy, and the PRC has no jurisdiction over Taiwan. Our citizens enjoy full political rights, and we reject any attempts to downgrade Taiwan. We in Taiwan are committed to maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and I'm sure that this has not gone unnoticed by the international community.
Sorry if there was a little bit of feedback in the earlier part of that line, but what the President was actually saying is that Beijing's formulation of one China is in essence one country, two systems. She goes on to say this is not acceptable to the people of Taiwan, especially in the light of the developments that we've witnessed in Hong Kong. Chen-wei, I wanted to ask you about popular attitudes to the one China policy in Taiwan.
Popular attitude. Let me quickly give you numbers from a very well-known daily newspapers in Taiwan. That's actually, they're also known for being critical to President Tsai's administration. This newspaper conducted an opinion polls early June this year, actually. And I think the results are quite telling. And in fact, if anything, reconfirming President Tsai's position, that is 75% of Taiwanese people cannot accept the idea of implementing one country, two systems in Taiwan. 68% of Taiwanese thought that PRC did not keep its promise to the people of Hong Kong to implement one country, two systems. And 65% of Taiwanese believe that if Taiwan were to accept one country, two systems, what happened in Hong Kong will also happen in Taiwan. I think that's a very accurate reflection of how Taiwan society views this one China. By the way, it's not policy, but it is principle for the PRC. It is one China principle, as you know very well. And one thing quickly I just want to add, Peter, that is oftentimes as a political scientist, we've all studied about the emergence of the current nation-state system within the international system. And it's rather a novel thing in the long history of humankind, probably for the last, 400 years, right? But I think that means, in fact, we've coexisted actually using different forms of government and governance. So, but PRC often sees sovereignty as sort of a zero-sum game, that anything short of its aspiration to maintain its claimed territory, land or sea, is a national shame and defeat by the conspiracy of external forces. It really doesn't need to be that way, actually. The parallel is not perfect. If there's anything wrong, I'd be happy for you to point it out for me. But I think Australia is a great example. Actually, for more than 100 years, Australia was a British colony, but became independent while still remains a member of Commonwealth. you all know this much better than I do, but maintains a very close relationship with the UK. If my memory serves right, I think the first official tour of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex was to visit Australia in 2018, and was very warmly received by Australians. And from my Australian friends, what I understand is the royal family of England is very, very well received. But so this very narrow interpretation of nation state, in fact, is a very novel concept for humankind. That's what I'm trying to say. And there have been many innovative ways to for different polities to coexist and still benefit mutually. The most important thing is to maintain peace, stability, and improve the welfare of all people with shared values of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And I think if China can sort of understand that and do some self-reflection, I think they'll be able to understand no one's threatening their country, and there are many ways we can resolve these issues of sovereignty, actually.
Chen-wei, thank you. I just noticed a viewer asking if you could name the newspaper where that survey was reported in your country.
That's classified. No. If my memory serves me right, I think it's United Daily.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Not so classified after all. Mark, you've done a lot of research around the One China policy, One China principle. And of course, the subtlety of this is that it isn't necessarily what Beijing says it is. Other countries reserve a right to interpret it differently. What's your take on the Australian approach at the moment?
So we have a One China policy, which deploys a deliberate and very specific ambiguity, which was put in place when we established diplomatic relations with the PRC in 1972, ambiguity about how we consider the status of Taiwan. So it's different from Beijing's One China principle, which is completely unambiguous. And we've used that deliberate ambiguity to build a very obviously effective relationship with China, with the PRC, over 4 decades, more than 4 decades, as well as maintain a very strong relationship to Taiwan. It also keeps us inside the US alliance as well. And so in some ways, our One China policy is really foundational for a lot of how Australia conducts its foreign policy.
Is it time for Australia to rethink how it applies it or interprets the One China principle?
Yeah, look, I think that's a big step. I'd probably say one of the issues for our One China policy is that although it's very studiously observed by Canberra, I think other levels of government and public institutions in Australia, state and local government in particular, often end up in practice observing Beijing's One China principle. So I think the integrity of our One China policy has actually been eroded over the years. And I think before we get to a thoroughgoing reassessment, I think there's certainly a case to be made for restoring the integrity of our One China policy and making sure that all levels of government and public institutions in Australia understand it and are able to use the opportunities that it presents, which I think at the moment are often not realised. I think there's lots of things that we could be doing in our relationship with Taiwan, which we don't do, because of uncertainty that exists at certain levels of our public and political life.
I hope we can get back to explore that thought before we close, but I want to go to the second question that we asked President Tsai now. We asked her, is Taiwan actually pursuing independence, or is, quote, reunification, unquote, possible? Let's go to that, Graham.
Taiwan is Taiwan. Our existence simply cannot be questioned. We have our own government, we have free elections, and our people can choose their own leaders. We have our own military and own democratic institutions, none of which have ever been under Beijing's jurisdiction. I also want to emphasize that the future of Taiwan is to be decided by the people of Taiwan. This is what we have been insisting. I also want to reiterate our commitments to peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. We are open to discussions with China as long as they contribute to a beneficial relationship. And it is important that such discussions are based on the 4 principles, that is peace, parity, democracy, and dialogue. Peace means we will seek peace with Beijing without the use of force to settle our differences. Parity refers to both sides not denying each other's existence. Democracy means Beijing must recognize that as a democracy, Taiwan's future will be decided by our own people. And dialogue means we will not refrain from discussions with Beijing that are not based on political preconditions. Taiwan is willing to promote cross-strait interactions if these pillars are upheld.
Sam, I want to go to you on this to talk about cross-strait relations in particular relating to technology interaction. And I see that we've just had a question come up from someone saying, well, in fact, Taiwan is one of the biggest chip producers in the world. Surely this gives Taiwan the ability to mediate between the West and China to some degree at an industrial scale. What's your sense of the interaction between Taiwan and China in terms of technology interlinkages, and how does that play into this broader political debate?
Sure. One general point is that Taiwan has very strong R&D in tech, but a lot of manufacturing takes place in the PRC. The US-China tech relationship greatly impacts Taiwan in terms of Taiwan's tech industry's economic dependence on China. So the semiconductor industry, for instance, sells to both the US and the PRC. And US export rules targeting Huawei put pressure on Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturers like TSMC, having a short-term impact on sales in the PRC. The rules also put pressure, I think, on companies like TSMC to reevaluate their business reliance on the PRC. Being friendly to both the US and China might be increasingly difficult. In terms of interdependence, I think, for instance, related to telecoms infrastructure, Taiwan's approach is not unlike Australia, except that Taiwan put restrictions on the presence of Chinese tech in 4G infrastructure in 2014, a generation ahead of the 5G debate that's played out globally in the last few years. Taiwan also recently imposed regulations that only allow Chinese investors to own up to 30% of Taiwanese companies in sensitive tech sectors like semiconductors. I think one test, though, will be how the Tsai administration handles ongoing cases. For instance, the Taiwanese company Datong, which does a lot of government database work in Taiwan, in addition to household appliances. There's evidence to indicate that the Taiwan and Hong Kong companies that are planning to purchase Datong are actually PRC proxies. My question is, does President Tsai use her authority to investigate the takeover? I think this is potentially a test.
Very interesting. So, Chen-wei, I just see we had a comment from someone saying that Taiwan doesn't see itself as part of China any more than New Zealand sees itself as part of Australia. I think I'll take that one as a comment rather than a question, but I did want to ask you about what are your judgments, Chen-wei, about the prospects for meaningful discussion between Taiwan and China. The president sort of sets out a framework for how that would need to happen from a Taiwanese perspective. What's the likelihood of something like that?
Prospects and likelihood. I think President Tsai has been extremely consistent in her first term, and now again her second term, is that we're always willing to talk. We're always willing to have meaningful discussions and dialogues, and that has not changed at all. That's the basic platform for her presidency. So it's hard to estimate whether that, the probability of such things, but we're always committed. I think no one would deny that we are committed.
Well, let's take the next grab from the president. Our questions were getting sort of sharper and sharper, I guess, from a military and strategic point of view. The next thing we asked her was to reflect on what are the risks of conflict and what would Taiwan expect of Australia. This is what she said.
The risk of conflict requires careful management by all the parties concerned. We expect and hope that Beijing will continue to exercise restraint, consistent with their obligations as a major regional power. Furthermore, the international community has closely followed the situation in Hong Kong, as well as China's militarization of South China Sea. As a result, there is now greater scrutiny over the situation in the Taiwan Strait. There continue to be significant concerns over the potential for accidents, given increased military activity in the region. Therefore, we believe it would be important for all parties to maintain open lines of communications to prevent misinterpretations or miscalculations. In terms of our interactions with Australia, we're grateful for Australia's advocacy for Taiwan's international space, including participation in the World Health Assembly. As the current pandemic exemplifies, it is important for all countries to be fully represented on the international stage, especially when it comes to health and public safety. We believe Taiwan being engaged internationally and having a voice at these international organizations is important to people all over the world. We hope that Australia also continues to recognize the importance of Taiwan's security in terms of the broader Indo-Pacific region. After Hong Kong, Taiwan stands increasingly on the front lines of freedom and democracy. We certainly hope that like-minded countries will continue to work together to ensure Taiwan's security, which is in the interest of peace and stability in the region.
Well, Chen-wei, let me go to you first. Yes, Australia's been a clear supporter of Taiwan's engagement in the WHO. Australia provides quiet support, I think I could put it that way, to Taiwan and its Pacific Islands representation. But clearly we're also talking about a much more direct challenge to the security of Taiwan. What's your thoughts about Australia in that context?
I think Australia can play a very constructive role in increasing stability and peace, especially in times where we feel there are real emerging security threats. For example, I know you've just announced a major package for future defense spending. Currently, Taiwan's defense budget is about 2.3% of our GDP, and I think that's, in relative terms, it's a bit more than Australia. As I understand, it's about 2% right now. And I think that shows the kind of commitment we have to maintaining that peace. Australia is a continent, but it's also an island nation. It's a maritime power. That means there are many cooperations we can actually begin and work on the possibilities of, in terms of exchanging and analyzing different intelligence and different malign gray zone activities or tactics that are being carried out right now in South China Sea or in East China Sea. That's something that definitely I think we can learn from each other and work with each other. And these are things I think we've so far stayed away from, but something that we can definitely prioritize with in the very near future.
Thanks, Chen-wei. I'd observe that as our economy starts to shrink because of COVID, we're going to be up there at 2.3% of gross national product on defence any time now, it seems to me. Although the difference in Australian thinking is that I think our government no longer sees the 2% as the ceiling of expenditure. It's now thinking of it likely as the floor, and it will sort of burst through that floor and probably have to do more. Mark, let me go to you for your comments on the President's observations about the risk of conflict.
Yeah, look, I think policymaking tends to be a bit focused on the prospect of a large-scale military conflict. I think it's also important to think about something on a smaller scale, the kind of tactical actions that we saw with China and India recently. So not a huge event, but nonetheless very tactically significant. So I think from the point of view of Australia, really having a very thorough and sober understanding of the kinds of the range of possible actions that could be very threatening to stability in the Taiwan Straits, and being able to calibrate Australia's responses to those things is very, very important. So we don't sort of panic. We're just able to recognize the constraints on Beijing and also why it might be doing certain things to advance its interests incrementally and calibrate an appropriate response to that.
We've been getting a lot of questions on the possibility of an Australia-Taiwan free trade agreement, and I don't want to sort of skip past that without giving you the opportunities for at least some quick comments on that. This is an agreement that has been a long time in the discussion. Mark, any thoughts about how we should be handling that going forward?
Yeah, this is a live prospect some years ago, and I think my understanding is Beijing was not happy with it, and so Australia sort of moved it to the back burner somewhat. I think as our relationship with Beijing has changed in the last sort of 2 or 3 years, there is perhaps an opportunity to rethink the trade relationship with Taiwan in that way, and perhaps in the context of multilateral configurations that are also being promoted at the moment in the region. So, yeah, I think it is worth Australia reconsidering.
Chen-wei, what are your thoughts? Australia-China free trade agreement? Sorry, Australia-Taiwan free trade agreement.
Well, I'm all for it. Well, the point being, the President Tsai has made it very clear that our economies are very, very complementary. We can both gain a lot from deeper economic exchanges. That definitely includes a free trade agreement. But I think we also need to approach this from a strategic point of view, is that having deeper economic exchanges between Australia and Taiwan, that includes a free trade agreement, will allow us to diversify the structure of our external trade. And that works to everybody's benefit. It's not just because of PRC. It's because it serves our national interests and because our economic structure complements each other, in fact. Obviously, there are real international politics involved when it comes to free trade agreement, but we can start the consultation process. There are difficulties in every trade negotiation, be it Taiwan or not. It will take a while, but I think it's time to really think of creative ways to begin that sort of consultation process actually for us.
Yes, and your point about diversification is a good one, and I'm sure it wasn't at all accidental that the President's speech touches on Taiwanese enjoying Australian wine and Australian beef, when of course these are the very things that are, one is banned and one is potentially going to be banned in the context of China. Let's go to question 4. We don't have too much time left in our discussion, but question 4, we asked President Tsai about how does Taiwan prepare for these more volatile and dangerous strategic times that we face. And in particular, as you listen to her response, listen out for what the President talks about as being the 3 components of Taiwan's response.
3 components are absolutely essential to ensure that Taiwan is adequately prepared. The first is our commitment to ensuring that we continue to take a pragmatic and consistent approach to our cross-strait policy. As I said during my inauguration speech, I will continue to uphold 4 principles in terms of cross-strait relations. That is peace, parity, democracy, and dialogue. This means that the international community can continue to expect that my overall commitment to cross-strait peace and stability will remain consistent into my second term. Another issue of importance is to strengthen our defense capabilities. We do this because we know that in terms of our current situation, strength can be correlated with deterrence. It also reduces the risk of military adventurism. To this end, my government has made quite serious commitment to increasing our defense budget, updating our defense strategies, including the overall defense concept, and ensuring that our men and women in uniform are better equipped and trained. The third component is to strengthen our linkages with like-minded countries. This is a situation that requires collective efforts, as well as recognition that Taiwan is on the front lines of democracy in the world. We will continue to seek a stronger security partnership with the United States and other like-minded countries in the region, built on our shared values and common interests.
So, Mark, let me put it to you. Is it possible for Taiwan to persist with a pragmatic and consistent policy towards China? Can that be done in the middle of China's wolf warrior moment? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think all Taiwanese presidents have to balance the aspirations of the Taiwanese electorate with the very challenging international circumstances that Taiwan finds itself in. It's on a geopolitical fault line, really. And Tsai's approach, I think, has been interesting in the sense that she's really built a kind of political team in government, and different figures in the government are able to message in different ways to help square that very challenging circle of contemporary politics. So I think in terms of what President Tsai is doing, it's probably as good as any political leader in Taiwan would be able to do under the current circumstances. And if we think back to the election in January, it could have been a very different outcome in theory, and that would be in a very different political landscape if that had been the case. Having said all of that, in the Xi era, there are just enormous challenges for all countries dealing with Beijing at the moment. It's much more assertive in its international relations. Beijing has a profound ideological problem with the DPP. And there have been some calls within China for Beijing to reach out to the DPP, but those haven't progressed very far. So Tsai has, I think, the best approach, but at a certain point, and I think Australia knows this as well, that can sometimes not be enough when you're facing the very distinctive challenges that Beijing is presenting at the moment.
Well, the second pillar of the President's comment was about strengthening defence capabilities. Chen-wei, I wonder if I could get you to talk about that. We've got a question here from one person watching us saying, what are the President's primary defence goals in her second term? What are your thoughts?
Primary defense goal is to further develop and enhance our asymmetric capabilities if there are any military contingencies. And this, I won't go into the details of that. It includes, increasing precision ammunition capabilities, our mobile land-based anti-ship system, mobile air defense system, etc., etc. And these all are on the agenda, and many of these weapon platforms weren't available to us before, are now available to Taiwan. So I think we'll see a very fundamental reform in our defense posture, and certainly we're also undergoing a very important reserve force reforms. And that is a very important deterrent factor. We want to create a very robust fighting force that is fully embedded with the regular force. And if we can be successful in that, I think definitely Taiwan is much safer than before.
Thank you. And a lot of those priorities would resonate with Australians as we think about our own defence update of just a month or two ago. Sam, I'm going to go to you for the President's third pillar, which was about working with like-minded countries. We've just had a question here about how does Taiwan act as a factor in Australian policy towards China. What's your thoughts about how Australia and Taiwan as like-minded countries can work together?
Sure. So President Tsai has called for collective efforts and recognition that Taiwan is on the front line of democracy in the world. And Australia's recent defense update described the deteriorating strategic environment for Australia, and it focused on the need for deterrence, for instance. I think one thing that Australia needs to do to protect the region's interests is to improve cooperation with democracies like Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea across all areas, economic, trade, cultural, not just security, in order to improve regional stability. And in terms of security, I think other areas for cooperation between Australia and Asian democracies, including Australia and Taiwan, is on issues like disinformation, information operations. Taiwan has many lessons to share in that space that other countries can learn from. Australia is also in a great position to rally general support for Taiwan in the international space and in the South Pacific region, utilizing its existing relationship with South Pacific countries. I think Australia could also promote closer ties with Taiwan through further efforts on the island. A good example might be how Australia is already taking the lead in coordinating emergency responses for South Pacific residents in Taiwan.
Well, folks, we're pretty much at time, but we do have one more question or one more answer from President Tsai that I want to play you, and then I'll ask the three of you for a brief response before we close. The final question we put to the President was about Taiwan's response to COVID, but in particular about building self-sufficiency and the lessons that come from having to deal with COVID. What I think is very interesting about this response, again, are the touch points which are very, very similar to how I think Australia thinks about its own situation. Let's listen to the President.
We are focused on COVID-19's economic implications, especially in terms of global supply chain restructuring. The pandemic has highlighted the risk of current supply chains in delivering essential medical supplies and PPE. As a result, free market economies around the world are looking much closely into global trade flows, supply chain security, as well as the need to reshore or re-establish certain strategic industries. In Taiwan, we were able to quickly mobilize our PPE industries in response to COVID-19, increasing the daily production of face masks from 1 million to 20 million. In the future, the government will provide greater support to keep several strategic industries onshore in order to ensure the steady supply of critical supplies. Sectors we are looking closely at include PPE, medical supplies, energy, and food. We believe it is important for countries to attain a certain level of self-sufficiency in critical sectors in the current international climate. Given the crucial link many of our companies play in the global supply chain, we are also closely watching changes in the international economy. COVID-19 has accelerated the trade tension between China and the United States. We want to ensure that our companies are well prepared to navigate the current trade environment, especially as they consider potential shifts, either in terms of manufacturing locations or markets.
So self-sufficiency, keeping industries, strategic industries onshore, supply chain security, again, very similar agendas in both countries. Colleagues, I'm going to give you each the luxury of 60 seconds each to end our discussion with some thoughts on Australia and Taiwan as we emerge, hopefully, from this COVID experience. Does this suggest closer relations between our two countries? And let me give you all the floor to just make final comments as you would like. Chen-wei, let me start with you.
60 seconds. Sounds like a television program. That's all right. I think President Tsai has laid out very clear policy tasks within her speech, very much like her style. And these are things we need to work on, and there's nothing more to add on that for me. But I would like to leave the audience on the other side of the internet with the questions of people always ask, is it independence or is it unification? That's the dichotomy of the question people always ask Taiwanese. But rather, I would like to ask the questions to the Australian friends that can you imagine a Taiwan that is not democratic, that is not governed by the rule of law, that does not respect human rights? Can you imagine a Taiwan heavily militarized with the capabilities to challenge the regional order and willing to threaten other countries in the region with possible military measures when there are differences? And can you imagine Taiwan possess the very competitive manufacturing and high-tech capabilities we do have now, but ready to use those assets to retaliate other countries when there are trade disputes. That's the end of my comments.
Thank you very much, Chen-wei. Sam, let me go to you for your closing remarks.
Sure. Just thinking about President Tsai's comments on supply chain security, I think that's an area where there's a huge alignment of interest between not only Australia and Taiwan, but also the US and Europe and everywhere else that's been highlighted by COVID-19. I think for Taiwan, when President Tsai highlighted the need for self-sufficiency in critical sectors, one thing to think about is whether or not her administration is able to make it more commercially viable for large companies to return manufacturing to Taiwan and base manufacturing in Taiwan. Is her administration able to remove the existing barriers that might make that impractical or undesirable at the moment? In terms of Australia and Taiwan relations, one thing, to improve not only economic relations, but also tourism, trade and tourism. Taiwan is a great destination for tourists, particularly as Hong Kong and China become more high-risk destinations. And it's something that Taiwan could actually capitalize on. And this would involve, building out existing trade and cultural relations. Australia is already a part of Taiwan's southbound policy, so that's something to consider. But otherwise, I'd just say that Australia's relationship with Taiwan is incredibly important. And in fact, liberal democracy's relationship with Taiwan is incredibly important. And I hope that we start to see Taiwan have a greater voice and participation in international forums.
Well, yes, let's hope that those tourist pathways can be opened up soon. I've been thinking about those beef noodles ever since the president mentioned them. Mark, final thoughts to you.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, the follow-up on both my colleagues' comments as well. The people of Taiwan have been pursuing self-determination and pursuing the Taiwan story for a very long time, for well over 100 years. And there's a history there that the international community does need to take seriously and to reckon with. But there's also, in that journey that the people of Taiwan have been on, there's also enormous opportunities. I think the Australia-Taiwan relationship is a very positive one. And within our existing frameworks, there are plenty more opportunities to realise. I think Taiwan, and quote President Tsai, it's a country, not an issue. There's a tendency to see it as an issue rather than as a place unto itself. And if we can generate a bit of mind share around exactly the opportunities that are in Taiwan and the story of Taiwan, then I think with a bit of creativity and dynamism from policymakers and also politicians in Australia, I think there are a lot of opportunities to explore.
Well, thank you, Mark. And just to conclude, I'd like to thank President Tsai Ing-wen for speaking with us and giving so generously of her time as she did. We hope this is going to be the first of a series of ASPI dialogues involving Asia-Pacific leaders. So please do stay tuned and in contact with us to find out what will be coming up next. Dr. Chen-wei Ling, Dr. Mark Harrison, Dr. Samantha Hoffman. You realise I'm the only person who's not a doctor in this conversation. It's been a privilege and illuminating conversation to have with the three of you, and I thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you.
And to those of you who are watching, thank you very much for your time as well. Please let us know what you think by the usual forms of feedback, and I hope that we'll have you again at a future ASPI in Asia-Pacific Leaders Dialogue into the future. Thank you very much.